On the 12th of June, 1884, a Geological Survey of Canada crew recorded a coal seam in a valley on the Red Deer River, in what was then the Northwest Territories. 139 mines would eventually work that valley, the first opening in 1911, the last closing in 1979. The coal ran close enough to the surface that a pick and a wagon were all it took to dig it. 2 months later, in August, the crew's 26-year-old leader, Joseph Burr Tyrrell, a coal and mineral surveyor with no training in bones, pulled a skull from the same rock that no one in his party could identify. He never named it. That went to an American scientist 21 years later, in 1905, while the valley kept digging coal as though the skull had never left the ground. Every one of those mines eventually closed. The rock underneath them was not finished. Chapter 1. The Rock and the River. The valley Tyrrell found in 1884 sits inside a single rock unit, and that fact carries more of this story than any other. Geologists call it the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, a banded stack of mudstone, sandstone, and coal more than 250 meters thick, laid down across the final stretch of the Cretaceous period as the shoreline of an inland sea slid back and forth across what is now central Alberta. Rivers built floodplains. Floodplains became swamps. Swamps compressed over several million years into the coal seams that would later run under the town's mines. The same rivers buried carcasses in the same mud that hardened into the same rock. The coal a miner followed with a pick, and the bone a paleontologist frees with a dental tool come out of the identical formation, and sometimes out of the same rock face, a few meters apart. None of it was visible from a wagon seat before the glaciers left. Roughly 10,000 years ago, meltwater pouring off the retreating ice sheets cut down through the topsoil that had covered this formation for millions of years, carving the Badlands the way a saw opens a log, fast by geological standards, and leaving the layered rock exposed on both banks of what became the Red Deer River. Everything Drumheller would ever be built on top of, or dug out from underneath, was opened up by water running off ice that had already been gone for most of human history by the time anyone thought to look at it. This is Blackfoot country. The Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy, held it together with the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, the Cree, and the Métis, and Blackfoot camps were still moving across this stretch of prairie in the 1870s, a decade before Tyrrell's survey party arrived and 30 years before anyone built a permanent house in the valley. Treaty 7 was signed on the 22nd of September, 1877, at Blackfoot Crossing on the Bow River, about 75 kilometers east of what is now Calgary, the agreement under which the Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda ceded the territory that would become this coal field. The Cree name for the river that cuts through the Badlands was Waskesiu Sipi, the Elk River. European arrivals heard the word for the animal, wrote it down as red deer instead of elk, and the mistranslation is the name printed on every map since. Tyrrell himself was not equipped to know what he had found in the rock that August. His mandate from the Geological Survey of Canada was to map coal and mineral deposits, not fossils, and his training was in geology and surveying, not in comparative anatomy. He shipped the skull east regardless, and it sat, catalogued but unnamed, for 21 years. It was Henry Fairfield Osborn, an American paleontologist who ran the American Museum of Natural History in New York, who examined it and in 1905 gave it a name: Albertosaurus sarcophagus, the flesh-eating lizard of Alberta, a province that did not exist yet when Tyrrell pulled the skull from the rock and would not exist for another 11 months. Tyrrell spent the rest of his career in mineral exploration and gold mining. He never published a description of a dinosaur in his life, and the museum that would eventually carry his name would carry it for the coal seams he mapped, not for the bone he happened to notice on his way past. By the time any of that mattered to a living soul, the valley had already produced its first paying resident, a man with no particular interest in fossils and only a passing one in coal. Chapter 2. A Coin Toss and a Coal Car. Thomas Patrick Greentree was a homesteader with no recorded trade before he arrived in this stretch of the Red Deer Valley, and in 1902 he built the first house standing in what would become the town site, a claim to being first that turned out in the end to be worth almost nothing. He did not file on the land formally until 1907, when the survey finally reached the valley and made the claim legal. For 5 years he had been living on ground he did not yet own, in a place that did not yet have a name anyone had agreed on, let alone a store, a school, or a railway siding. In 1910, Greentree sold that land to Samuel Drumheller, a promoter and speculator who had come looking for a town site rather than a farm, and had the capital to make one out of raw prairie. What happened next has been told the same way for more than a century. The two men settled the matter of whose name the town would carry with a coin toss, and Greentree lost. The first store in the valley had already opened the year before, in 1909, run by men whose names appear nowhere on a map. Greentree's house came first. His name is on nothing. The coal came next, and it came fast. In 1911, the first load left the valley by wagon, and Samuel Drumheller began mining near the town site that now carried his name. The mine that actually turned the valley into a business rather than a claim was the Newcastle, opened the same year by Jesse Gouge and Garnet Coyle, two operators who understood something the geology had already made obvious. This coal did not need to be good. It only needed to be close to the surface and close to a market. It was lignite, soft and domestic grade, the kind that burned dirty and fast and would never compete on quality with the harder coal coming out of the mountains to the west. It did not have to. A prairie with almost no trees and a winter that lasted 5 months needed fuel of any grade it could get, in whatever quantity a shovel and a wagon could move. A house on the prairie was a customer. So was a school, a hotel, a steam locomotive running between Winnipeg and the Rockies. Anything that burned fuel, and increasingly that fuel came out of a shallow seam, a few kilometers outside, a town site that had existed, formally, for less than a year. The economics were almost embarrassingly simple. Dig near the surface, load a wagon, sell it before the snow came. Men who had never mined anything in their lives were doing it within months of the first load leaving because the barrier to entry was a pick, a horse, and a claim. And the barrier to a customer was the front door of the nearest farmhouse. None of this required a railway yet. It required only enough coal moving out of the valley by wagon to prove that a railway would be worth building. A wagon could carry a few tons at a time, over a trail that turned to gumbo mud every spring, and it was already more than the local farms alone could account for. By 1911, that proof already existed in the ledgers of men like Gouge and Coyle, if not yet on any map a surveyor in Calgary had bothered to draw. A survey crew would reach the valley within the year to change that. Chapter 3. The Wonder Town of the West. A station went up in 1912, and the Calgary and Drumheller branch line of the Canadian Pacific Railway reached the valley in 1913, which meant that everything Gouge, Coyle, and Samuel Drumheller had proven by wagon could now move by the carload. Incorporation followed on a schedule that reads like a town outrunning its own paperwork. Village status arrived on the 15th of May, 1913. Town status arrived on the 2nd of March, 1916. City status arrived on the 3rd of April, 1930. Each step took less time than the one before it, which is not the usual order in which prairie towns grow. The population told the same story in smaller, harder numbers. In 1916, the town counted 312 people. By 1921, it counted 2,499, a rise of 701% in 5 years. In a country where most towns were pleased with 7% in a decade, local boosters started calling it the Wonder Town of the West. And for a few years, the name was not much of an exaggeration. Drumheller was, by growth rate, among the fastest expanding municipalities anywhere in Canada, built almost entirely on a mineral that most Canadians never saw before it was already burning in their stove. Growth on that scale needed labor faster than the valley could produce it locally, so the mine operators went looking in Europe. Agents promised recruits company housing and steady wages, the standard pitch used to move men across an ocean for work they had never seen. What a great many of them found on arrival was canvas tenting, overcrowded and infested with bedbugs, no medical facility within reach, and no supply of clean water. Conditions that let typhoid move through the camps the way it moves through any settlement, short on plumbing, and long on new arrivals packed close together. The company housing promised in a recruiting office in Glasgow or Lviv turned out in the valley to be a tent and a shared latrine. The operators had a second policy, less advertised than the first. Work crews were deliberately assembled from men who did not share a language. A Ukrainian beside a Hungarian, beside an Italian, none of them able to compare complaints in a tongue the foreman also understood. It was a cheap and effective way to prevent organization, and it worked for exactly as long as the operators needed it to. A grievance that cannot be translated cannot spread past the man who has it. And a company that controls both the paycheck and the boarding house has every reason to keep it that way. Miners arrived from Britain, Italy, Ukraine, Poland, and Hungary in numbers large enough that the valley's social order sorted itself along the same lines the boarding houses did. British-born crews in one bunkhouse, Central Europeans in another. The hierarchy of the coal company reproduced in where a man was permitted to sleep and which mess hall fed him. The wonder town of the West was being built, in other words, on the same math as every other coal boom of its era. Cheap fuel, cheap land, and labor recruited from places poor enough that a canvas tent and a bedbug still looked like an improvement. That math would eventually run the length of an entire industrial valley, 35 kilometers of it, and give it a shape the maps had not shown a decade earlier. Chapter 4, 35. Kilometers of one industry. By the 1920s, the valley was no longer a single town with mines around it. It had become one continuous industrial corridor, roughly 35 kilometers long, running from Knack Mine at the west end to East Cooley at the east, with Midland Vale, Newcastle, North Drumheller, Rosedale, Cambria, Lehigh, and Wayne strung along it in between. Each of these places had its own mine, its own tipple, its own boarding house, and its own store, and most of them had almost nothing else. No independent economy, no reason to exist beyond the seam a particular company was working that decade. A traveler moving along the valley floor in those years would have passed from one company's jurisdiction into another's every few kilometers, each with its own name, its own payroll, and its own tipple silhouette against the coulee walls. By total output, the Drumheller field became the second largest coal producer in Western Canada, behind only the mines of the Crousness Pass, and ahead of every other coal field the province had. Wayne is the clearest surviving example of how these places were built, because Wayne is the one that changed its name to match its industry and never changed it back. It began as Rose Deer, named for the Rose Deer Mine, which operated from 1912 until 1934 and gave the settlement its entire reason for being. In 1913, the Rose Deer Coal Company built a hotel to house its own workforce, with a bar attached for the hours a man was not underground. The hotel was the Rose Deer. The bar was the Last Chance Saloon. Both opened in 1913. Both are still open today, serving customers in a settlement that has not had a working mine in 9 decades. Getting to Wayne required, and still requires, driving through a canyon in 150 meters deep and crossing 11 bridges over the Rosebud River in about 6 kilometers of road. A concentration of river crossings tight enough that it holds a Guinness World Record for the most bridges over the shortest distance. None of those bridges were built for scenery. They were built because a coal company needed its workforce to get to a tipple on the other side of a river that would not sit still, and 11 bridges were what the terrain demanded. The road still crosses every one of them, single lane at a time, and it is still the only road in. What actually lasted out of everything the coal era built along this 35-kilometer corridor turns out to be very little. The mines are all closed. The tipples are mostly gone, dismantled for scrap or left to fall in on themselves. The company stores, the boarding houses, the schools built to serve a population that no longer lives here. None of it is still standing in any working form. The single most durable structure this industry produced in the entire valley is a bunkhouse with a bar attached, built in 1913 to hold miners between shifts. Still standing, still pouring drinks, in a settlement whose population today would not fill it twice over. It was never meant to outlast anything. It was meant to get a shift of tired men, fed, dry, and asleep before the whistle blew again at dawn. The corridor kept growing anyway, through the 1920s and into the war years, and by the end of that growth, the company town had become something closer to a company machine. Chapter 5. A second peak and a company that owned everything. In 1939, with war declared, The Drumheller coalfield was designated nationally important to the war effort, and the mines that had been running on prairie demand for 2 decades began running around the clock for a different customer. Coal that had once heated farmhouses and fired locomotives now moved a wartime economy that needed fuel for barracks, for training bases, for the factories that had switched overnight to munitions and aircraft parts. The valley's second peak came in the middle 1940s, and by every measure available, it was larger than the boom of the 1920s had been. More tonnage, more men underground, more money moving through company ledgers than at any point since the first coal car left in 1911. East Cooley alone held more than 3,000 residents at its height, with dozens of businesses along its main street, serving a population that a decade earlier would have seemed impossible for a coal camp at the end of a branch line. The figure the valley told about itself in those years was more than 30,000 people living in the corridor from Nakmeen to East Cooley, a number that shows up in local histories and tourism material more often than in any census, because it counted transient single men in bunkhouses and boarding camps that no enumerator ever fully reached. No official count of the whole coal camp population survives to confirm or contradict it. What the census did count, for the incorporated city itself, rather than the camp strung out around it, was considerably smaller and far easier to check. 2,987 people in 1931, a number that then fell at every count taken through 1951. Whatever its precision, it was the number the valley believed about itself, and it was not a modest one, 30,000 people, in a stretch of Cooley Bottom that most Albertans could not have located on a map a generation earlier. Behind that number sat a machinery of ownership that left almost nothing outside company control. The Midland Mining Company worked Midland No. 1 and Midland No. 2, alongside the Western Gem and the Brilliant, each employing up to 100 men. Midlandvale, the settlement built to house them, held more than 600 people at its peak, and every one of those people lived in a company house, bought groceries at a company store, and sent their children to a company-adjacent school. There was, in practice, very little a Midlandvale family could do: eat, sleep, shop, learn, worship, that did not eventually settle back onto the company's own books. The United Mine Workers, for its part, organized baseball in summer, soccer alongside it, and hockey through the winter, not as recreation alone, but as a deliberate demonstration to the companies and to the men themselves of what coordinated bodies of workers could do when they moved together on a schedule. A baseball team that could field 9 men on time, in matching uniforms, on a diamond the union itself had leveled and lined, was also a rehearsal for the kind of coordination a strike would eventually require. The mine, the housing, the store, the school, and the ball diamond all sat on the same balance sheet, whichever side of that ledger a given family happened to occupy. None of that machinery was new by 1939. Every piece of it, the company housing, the company store, the imported and deliberately divided labor force, even the discipline the ball diamonds were quietly rehearsing, had already been tested once, 20 years earlier. In a summer the coal companies did not commemorate, and the men who lived through it did not forget. Chapter 6. August 1919. On the 24th of May, 1919, miners across the Drumheller Valley walked off the job under the banner of the One Big Union, joining a provincial strike that involved roughly 6,500 men, a large share of the coal workforce of Alberta in a single season. The companies did not negotiate. Within weeks, the provincial government gave 13 coal companies permission to hire returned soldiers as special constables, a legal status that granted them the same authority as a police officer for the length of their appointment, though none of them had received police training of any kind. The men hired were paid $10 a day, supplied with free alcohol, and issued pick handles, crowbars, and brass knuckles, rather than any standard issue equipment. No training record survives for what these men were told to do with them, or by whom. The strike ran through June and July with no settlement in sight, the special constables already sworn in and paid and waiting through the whole of that stretch. On the 9th of August, 77 days after the walkout began, 5 men attacked the One Big Union's organizer for the valley, John Sullivan, inside his own home. Sullivan escaped the attack only because a neighbor arrived carrying a rifle. The neighbor is not named in any surviving account. Nothing in the surviving record indicates that any of the 5 men involved were ever charged. 2 nights later, on the 11th and 12th of August, the special constables went house to house, up and down the coal corridor from Nakmain to East Cooley. It was not 1 raid, but 2, a night apart, as though the first had not settled the matter to anyone's satisfaction. Men were hung upside down by their feet, tarred and feathered, forced to drink horse urine. 2 strike leaders were tied to telephone poles and beaten until they were nearly unconscious. Others were loaded onto trucks, driven 30 or 40 miles out of the valley, and left there on foot with no way back except to walk it. Men who ran for the hills when the trucks arrived were tracked down in the open country and beaten where they were caught. The same men who had been recruited from Britain, Italy, Ukraine, Poland, and Hungary, and kept apart on the job so they could not organize in a shared language, were, on those 2 nights, hunted by name, 1 address at a time, by men who had themselves been recruited and paid for the purpose only weeks before. The provincial police filed a report on what had happened over those 2 nights. The report describes the events as the work of citizens and returned soldiers' organizations expelling agitators from the valley. The word agitators is not further defined anywhere in the document. It names no perpetrator of the beatings, the tarring, or the forced marches into the countryside. It records exactly 1 arrest arising from the violence of the 11th and 12th of August, 1919. The man arrested was a striking miner. He was charged with possessing a firearm. Chapter 7. The cold part of the story. The strike ended not long after the 12th of August, and the men went back underground with no union of their own choosing. What replaced the one big union in the valley was a contract with the United Mine Workers of America, negotiated over their heads and handed to them as the price of being allowed back to work. Nobody asked the men who had been hung upside down whether this was the arrangement they wanted. Nobody asked the men who had been tarred and feathered. Nobody asked the men who had been driven 30 or 40 miles out onto the prairie at night and left to walk home. The mines needed coal moving again, and coal did not care who ran the union that supplied the labor to dig it. The strikebreakers did not fare much better, though for entirely different reasons. Within months, the same companies that had paid them $10 a day and armed them with pick handles began laying them off as inefficient workers, men hired for their willingness to break heads, not for any particular skill at hauling coal. In their place, the companies rehired the immigrant miners those same men had beaten. British-born returned soldiers had been used to drive Ukrainian, Polish, Italian, and Hungarian miners back underground at gunpoint in all but name. And within a season, both groups were back exactly where the coal companies wanted them, doing the jobs the coal companies needed done. The soldiers who had done the beating were surplus to requirements. The men who had been beaten were not. 6 years of peace followed. In June of 1925, the United Mine Workers of America agreed to a 15% wage cut on behalf of the Drumheller miners, without consulting the men who would actually take the reduction in their pay envelopes. Drumheller struck again. This time the strike broke from the inside rather than from an outside force. A significant number of miners kept working through it, and the provincial police were deployed not to attack strikers this time, but to protect the men who stayed on the job. The same police force in the same valley, now guarding the men who 6 years earlier had been the ones dragged out of their houses. A violent confrontation between police and strikers on the 26th of June effectively ended the walkout. What came out of that defeat was not silence. It was a new union, the Mine Workers Union of Canada, formed by miners who had lost faith in the American organization that had cut their wages without asking them. For the next decade, the 2 unions fought each other across the coal fields of Western Canada as fiercely as either had ever fought a coal company, membership against membership, local against local, recruiting drive against recruiting drive, until the 2 sides finally declared a truce and left the field to divide itself along whatever lines the men themselves preferred. Men who had been beaten for organizing, laid off for breaking heads, and cut in pay without consultation, had at least, by the end of it, organizations of their own choosing again. What they still did not have, in 1925 or at any point after it, was a say in when the mines that employed them would close, or what would replace the coal once it stopped being wanted. Chapter 8. What the Money Built, While It Lasted. In 1931, a suspension bridge went up across the Red Deer River at Rosedale, strung there for one purpose: getting miners across the water to the Star Mine on the far bank without a boat or a detour. 117 meters of pedestrian bridge, built for nothing more romantic than a shift change, twice a day, in every weather the valley produced. Nothing about the valley's engineering in these years was monumental. There were no arches raised for their own sake, no plaques laid for a governor-general to unveil. Every structure in the corridor was functional, built to move either coal or the men who dug it, and the bridge at Rosedale would carry foot traffic across it for more than 70 years, after the mine it served had shut down, sold off its equipment, and gone quiet on the far bank. 5 years later, in 1936, the Atlas coal mine began operating as Atlas No. 3, and in 1937, it raised the wooden tipple that still stands over the site today. More than 7 stories of timber framing, now the last wooden coal tipple standing anywhere in Canada, and the largest one left standing in North America. Around it grew the rest of a working mine: a wash house, a supply house, a lamp house, a mine office, a blacksmith shop, a conveyor tunnel running 210 feet underground, and a battery-powered locomotive built before the tipple itself that the crews called Linda. The Atlas was, structurally, the most complete mine ever built in this valley, more thoroughly equipped than anything Nakamine or Midland Vale or Cambria had managed in the boom years before it. It went up at the exact moment the market for the coal it was built to produce had roughly a decade left to run, and every plank of the tipple, every foot of that conveyor tunnel, was an investment against a future that was already, quietly, running out. Downtown carried the same money differently. Picture Center Street on a Saturday evening in 1947, payday for a valley of miners with cash in their pockets and nowhere else to spend it. The 3-story White House Hotel anchors one corner, its windows lit. The Napier Theater and the Midway Theater run competing pictures a block apart, both drawing lines. A Canadian national train sits at the station that will keep carrying passengers until 1970. 23 years still ahead of it. Underneath the street, tunnels cut during Prohibition still connect certain basements to certain back doors, used for whatever a dry province's residents were still buying after dark. Some of that same underground network reportedly included escape routes as well as tunnels, and enough of it survives today to remain part of the town's own folklore. Center Street's commerce did not stop at the street itself, either. It ran along the avenues off it too, each one catching its own share of the same payday. A few thousand men with a week's wages move through that stretch of pavement on the same afternoon, and every business on the block is built to catch some part of it before the shift changes again on Monday. None of what stood on Center Street that Saturday was built to last past the industry that paid for it. The bridge at Rosedale, the tipple at the Atlas, the lit windows of the White House, every one of them was financed by a coal seam with an expiry date. Nobody downtown had calculated yet, in a town that had, up to that point, only ever known its coal business to grow. Chapter 9, 207 Names. Across the 68 years the Drumheller mines operated, 207 men were killed underground or around the workings, a rate of about 3.5 deaths for every 1,000,000 tons of coal the valley produced. The causes recorded across those decades are the ordinary causes of underground coal mining anywhere: roof falls, runaway cars, gas, fire, machinery that did not stop when a hand was where it should not have been. No single disaster accounts for a majority of the total. Most of the 207 died one at a time, in incidents that made the local paper for a week and then did not. The first was Harry Holden in 1913, at the Drumheller mine, in the same year the valley's first coal was still being sold, as a novelty rather than a necessity. Holden was not a miner. He was a visitor on an unauthorized tour of the workings, and he was killed when a mine car was not properly secured. He was in the ledger the valley would keep, mine by mine, for the next 68 years, the first entry. On the 24th of June, 1941, a methane explosion in one of the valley's mines killed 3 men: Jack Waters, 37, Chris Busness, 53, and Robert Taylor, 70. A rescue party was assembled at the Atlas next door and went in after them. The mine manager who led it, Harry Crowder, 54, died of carbon monoxide poisoning while searching underground for the 3 men his crew had come to bring out. The rescue effort itself produced a fourth death before it recovered any of the first three. Of the 207 deaths recorded across the whole valley, 13 happened at the Atlas alone, in a mine that had been built only 4 years earlier to be the most modern and best equipped in the entire corridor. This was what the valley was in the years just before it ended. Every mine this valley had ever registered, operating at one time or another across those 68 years. 13 recognizable communities strung along 35 kilometers of coulee, each with its own tipple and its own graveyard entries. The second largest coal output in Western Canada, behind only the Crows Pass. A workforce recruited from a dozen countries, sorted by language into bunkhouses their employers had assigned them, some of them beaten in their own homes, 20 years earlier by men their own employers had also hired and armed. It supplied fuel for nearly every kitchen stove and every steam locomotive on the Canadian prairies, an entire domestic and rail market built on soft, local, unglamorous lignite dug a few meters below the surface, by men whose names, when they died doing it, ended up on a list 207 names long. Both of those markets, the stove and the locomotive, were about to be replaced within a single decade by two things being developed at the same time, a few hundred kilometers away. Chapter 10. What Leduc Changed. In February of 1947, a well called Leduc No. 1 came in south of Edmonton, and Alberta's entire energy economy changed direction inside a few years. It was not an event that touched Drumheller directly. Nobody in the valley worked at Leduc, no pipe from that well ran anywhere near the coulee, and no explosion or strike or scandal connected the two places at all. What happened instead was quieter than any of that, and considerably harder to fight. Households across the province began converting their furnaces from coal to natural gas, and the railways began converting their locomotives from steam to diesel, and both of those changes removed one household and one locomotive at a time. The customers Drumheller's coal industry had spent 4 decades building itself to serve. There was no single closing day, no last whistle blown across every mine at once. The demand simply moved to a different fuel, and the mines closed one at a time through the 1950s as their markets went quiet under them. First, the smaller operations, and then, gradually, the larger ones. Drumheller's coal had always been soft, local, and domestic grade, cheap to dig, cheap to burn, and useless to ship any real distance, which had never mattered while every prairie town within a few hundred kilometers needed exactly that kind of fuel. That had been the whole advantage for 4 decades. Against natural gas piped directly into a furnace, requiring no delivery, no ash, and no shoveling, it was no advantage at all. Wayne shows what that looked like in census figures rather than memory. 601 people lived there in 1941, when the mines were still running at wartime capacity. By 1951, the number was 357, a drop of more than 40% in a single decade. By 1991, it was 43. The mines that had given the settlement its reason to exist, the Rose Deer, the Hamilton, the Jewel, the Ideal, were all shut by the end of the 1950s, within a decade of Leduc coming in. Somewhere between 24 and 40 people live in Wayne today, depending on who is counting, in a place that tourism copy still describes, without much regard for any of those numbers, as a town of 2,500. The same promotional material is not even consistent with itself. Some of it gives 2,500. Other copy claims more than 3,000, and neither figure has ever been reconciled with the other, or with anything a census recorded. East Coulee went the same direction from a larger base. More than 3,000 residents at its wartime peak collapsed by the middle 1950s into a commercial strip of exactly 3 businesses: a hotel, a garage, and a grocery store, serving a population that had shrunk faster than any single business could plan around. That more than 3,000 figure comes from the government of Alberta's own energy heritage records rather than a formal census, and it was never a single-year count. East Coulee had brushed against roughly the same number once before, around 1930, long before the wartime demand that pushed it there a second time. The school held on longer than the mines had, but it closed by 1970, which is roughly the point at which a coal settlement stops being a community with its own institutions and becomes an address on a highway. Fewer than 200 people live in East Coulee now, Neither Wayne nor East Cooley had a single dramatic ending to point to. No headline, no last shift photographed for the paper. By the end of the 1950s, only one mine anywhere in the valley was still running on anything like its old schedule. Chapter 11. The Last Mine and the First Park. The Atlas held on longer than anything else in the valley, but the terms of its survival tell the same story as everywhere else, only slower. It went from year-round operation to seasonal. Its payroll went from more than 200 miners down to 60. It closed in 1979, the last of the 139 mines that had operated in this valley since 1911. The last man to die in a Drumheller coal mine was William Herman at the Atlas, of a heart attack. Not an explosion, not a roof fall, not a runaway car, but a heart giving out on an ordinary shift in an industry that had, by then, mostly stopped killing men the way it once had. The pivot happened in the same 12 months, and it happened quietly, with no ceremony that made the wire services. On the 5th of June, 1979, the worked-out Midland mine site became Midland Provincial Park. The land for it had come from the coal industry itself, 595 hectares donated in 1974 by Sidney McMullen, president of the Midland Mining Company, years before anyone knew the Atlas would be the last mine standing when the industry finally stopped. The last mine in the valley shut down, and the first mine in the valley, the one where a company president had thought a donated coulee bottom might make a decent park, became a park inside the same 12 months. Nobody involved in either event was thinking about dinosaurs. What actually kept Drumheller itself standing, though, had arrived well before either of those closures. The Drumheller Institution, a federal medium security penitentiary, opened on the 25th of August, 1967, with roughly 200 staff drawing federal salaries that did not depend on the price of coal. A regional hospital filled in behind it, along with provincial and municipal offices, servicing for the gas and oil industry now operating across the province, and agriculture, which had never left. Between 1964 and 1972, the city annexed Bankview, Midland, Newcastle, and North Drumheller, which is the reason the old population tables jumped so sharply in those years. Growth on paper that was really just new boundaries drawn around people who were already there. A federal payroll had replaced a coal payroll roughly a decade before anyone in Edmonton proposed building a museum. That proposal came in 1981, and in 1982, the provincial government allocated $30 million to build it, part of Premier Peter Lougheed's program of placing provincially run museums and interpretive centers in small Alberta towns, rather than concentrating them in Edmonton and Calgary. BCW Architects of Calgary designed the building, with Doug Craig as lead architect. David Baird became its founding director. It went up inside Midland Provincial Park on the old coal mine, not at Dinosaur Provincial Park near Brooks, roughly 2 hours south, where the fossil beds are actually richest, with 58 dinosaur species and more than 500 cataloged specimens, and a UNESCO World Heritage designation dating to 1979. The museum went where the town needed it, on the site of a mine that had been generating royalties for a coal company 8 years earlier, and was now generating a construction contract for a government architect. The fossils, as it turned out, were close enough. Construction ran for 3 years on that budget, on that site, before the province had anything ready to open to the public. Chapter 12. The Same Rock. The Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology opened on the 25th of September, 1985, 12,500 square meters of gallery, built 6 years after the valley's last mine closed. On the 28th of June, 1990, Queen Elizabeth II granted it the royal title. The collection has since passed 160,000 cataloged fossils and more than 350 holotypes, with roughly 3,000 added every year, of which about 800 are on display, close to half of 1% of the total. Among them, Black Beauty, among the most complete Tyrannosaurus skeletons known. Borealopelta, the best preserved armored dinosaur found, dug out by oil sands workers in the north, and Albertonectes, a Guinness World Record holder for the longest neck of any animal. The ATCO Tyrrell Learning Center followed in 2003, and a $9.3 million learning lounge opened in 2019. For 4 decades, a bus at dawn and a Badlands walk have been standard for Alberta school children. free entry for school groups from the 1st of September to the 30th of June, overnight programs, simulated excavations. More than 16 million people have come through the doors since 1985, at more than 520,000 a year now. The museum turned 40 on the 25th of September, 2025. The town built its own attraction on that traffic. The world's largest dinosaur opened on the 13th of October, 2000, 26.2 meters of fiberglass and steel, 145,000 pounds of it, built for $1,065,000, with a staircase inside and a viewing platform in the mouth. She was named Tyra, given a $300,000 refit in 2020. In March of 2025, the Chamber of Commerce confirmed that when her lease expires in December of 2029, she will be dismantled, which took the town council by surprise. The museum was built by a province, and it is permanent. The roadside dinosaur was built by a Chamber of Commerce. It is not. The Atlas, saved from demolition by the Dinosaur Valley Heritage Society from 1987, became a provincial historic resource in 1989 and a National Historic Site in 2002, and still runs guided tours from May to Thanksgiving. The Starmine Suspension Bridge, closed nearly 4 years after its northeast support failed, reopened to foot traffic in January of 2024. The Rose Deer and the Last Chance still pour drinks in the building, put up as a bunkhouse in 1913. Listed for sale at $925,000 in 2021, reachable only by those same 11 bridges. The Hoodoos stand nearby, roughly 10 columns of white sandstone caprock over dark marine shale, 1 to 3 meters high, across 11 protected hectares. On the 10th of November, 2012, a head frame wheel from the Atlas was mounted on black granite downtown, engraved with 207 names. The census figures tell a different story than the popular one. On today's boundaries, the valley held 8,134 people in 1956 and 7,909 in 2021. It bottomed out at 6,977 in 1966. Before the prison had proven itself, before the museum had been proposed, before anyone in Edmonton had spent a provincial dollar on either one. For 70 years, the population has barely moved. Tourism now accounts for about $116 million in economic impact and close to 1 job in 4. Median household income was $74,000 in 2021. An $80 million flood mitigation program has run along more than 100 kilometers of riverbank since 2019. Wayne and East Cooley emptied out and never came back. Drumheller itself never collapsed. The museum did not save the town so much as tell the rest of the country it was still there. In one wall of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, there is a black seam that men went underground for, and a few meters above it, there is a bone that people now drive 4 hours to look at, and the same river. Cut through both of them on its way to somewhere else.